You might get a little pop-up saying we are now recording. Welcome to those of you who are joining us later on YouTube as well. So because this is a webinar, everybody's muted, your cameras are off. As I mentioned, this recording is going to be stored on our YouTube channel. We also have all of our past webinars saved on our YouTube channel as well. So after this, if you're just really gung-ho and you want to go learn some more, check out that YouTube channel, give us a follow or whatever it's called on YouTube, and let us know if you have any questions. Please feel free. You can email me anytime. My email is the one attached to your Zoom invitation. So drop me an email if you have any questions. If you do have questions during the webinar, use that Q&A box. That lets everybody else see your questions. It also makes it easier for us to find them all at the end. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can here at the end. For your safety, you should only be able to see what I post in the chat, but just in case somebody manages to get around that, please don't click any links other than what I might post there. On the TCF side of things, we want to give a big thank you to Itasca Bank for sponsoring this webinar. Sponsors like Itasca Bank help us to keep these webinars free for everybody. Contact me for more information on sponsoring webinars. If you have a company or somebody who wants to sponsor a webinar, let us know. We can definitely do that. After this webinar, you're going to be taken to a page with a bunch of resources on things you might be interested in, such as our native plant guide, rain barrel information, and so much more, but including our virtual tip jar. So if you're enjoying these webinars, I do encourage you to donate to help keep all these webinars free, much like our sponsors do, and to help us continue to do all the really awesome things that we do, because we do so much more than just these webinars. This will also make you a member, so you can enjoy a variety of members only stuff and get the emails where we talk about upcoming webinars. Speaking of which, next week we'll be talking about critters in the stream with the Forest Preserve District of DuPage County. This will be another one. Jan will be joining you instead of me as your host. And then on January 27th, we're going to be talking with folks at the College of DuPage about Little Campus on the Prairie. So the pollinator garden and the native plant gardens that are there at the College of DuPage. So we've got that going on. So please make a note and make sure you join us next week and in the future. I've got all kinds of other great webinars coming up too. So keep your eyes posted to Facebook for that. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Amanda. And I have you come very highly recommended by everybody at TCF. So I'm very excited to learn a little bit more about style and design today.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here, especially with people from all over the country. That's always fun. So welcome everyone on this dreary day in Chicago for us. But I just want to talk today about what your landscape style is. Everybody thinks, and obviously from our poll, that you're natural, you might be a little bit formal, maybe chaotic. I love this first image, and I love when I get to talk to you in person, obviously, because I always get great reactions from this image. So I can't see your faces, but you probably wondered, am I in the right webinar? If you signed in today, like, oh my gosh, what is this lady going to talk about? But I love this image because we all feel like this is our own landscape. No matter how beautiful your landscape is, we all are very critical about our style and our perception. And so today I want to talk about some of those perceptions, but finding out what your landscape style is, pose a few questions for you to figure out how you can figure that out, give you some tools to figure out what the landscape is as far as style and what it looks like. So let's dive right in. So when you take a look at these images, what is the first thing that you see? What drew your eye immediately? And I specifically picked these images for a lot of reasons. What draws your eye? Is it the color? Is it the texture? Is it shapes, forms, artwork? All of these are very artistic pictures. But the reason why I like this collage of images is because everybody sees something a little bit differently. Whether you see the vegetation and you're drawn to the landscape part, or some people see the majesty of the columns or the architecture, or the form of the art. We have this fun little frog drinking in a teacup on a rock. So I love this group of images because everybody's drawn to, sometimes you see the big orange, splotch of paint that's out in the landscape, but everybody's drawn to a different style. And the important thing to remember about your landscape style in particular is it's going to be unique from the person next to you. It might even be very unique from your spouse or significant other. One of the greatest stories that I have is I worked with a wonderful couple. They had been married 27 years, but the minute I showed up at their house, the lovely wife said, "Okay, it's my turn with you." And I said, "Okay." She goes, "No, I get the front yard and my husband gets the backyard because we have two completely different styles." And she said, "We've been happily married for 27 years and that's the way we do things." And I love that story because she was very texture oriented and he was very color oriented. And I did a design for their front and backyard and it turned out beautifully and it flowed well together. So don't be afraid to have your own unique style. It doesn't have to be like everybody else, but it should follow some general forms and structure. And we're going to talk about that today. So what is landscape style? Is it a noun, an adjective, an adverb, verb? This is one of my favorite pictures, and most of you will recognize this picture as the work of the wonderful master Chihuly, but his work is just inspiring to me. And his is a style all his own. You can definitely walk out into the landscape and say, that's Chihuly's work. When he puts glass, it's wonderful. But that's what a landscape style is. It speaks to you on multiple levels. So it's all those things. It's nouns, it's adjectives, it's adverbs, it's verbs. It's something that's dynamic and different. And people feel like it's a very static thing, and that's not true. So for me, landscape style is really a history of ideas and realities. We're trying to create either this idea of this landscape and this type of landscape, or we're trying to create the history of the reality of the space. What did this look like? Are we going back to more natural forms? Are we kind of creating this idea of structure or formality? It's also art. That's obvious. Most of the time when we think about landscape style, we particularly think about art. Art is an expression of existence. It's our personal experience. It has to, your style has to be yours, truly. It can't be anybody else's. Culture of people and places is huge. Landscape style varies across the country. And this is a great conversation to have since we have people from all over the country and Canada. It varies. You go across the country and you start out with this New England style, and you have a Southern style and a Midwestern style, and you have your kind of Middle West, your prairie states and plains, and then you go out to the mountains and you have your West Coast. I'm sure it's very similar in Canada. You have different areas of culture and people and how that has influenced the landscape, and then how it's reflected in the landscape. It's also a perspective. Landscape style is always changing as nature does, but it's a perspective of life and nature. So it's our personal view of what our piece of nature looks like. And landscape style can vary. We had a couple people answer that their front yard is different than their backyard. That's very true. A perspective is very unique to that ecosystem. Most people think, oh, they have a front yard, a backyard, and side yards. That's what they see their house. That's what we're trained to see. But really, you have multiple areas where you can play with style and texture because each area of your yard has a different ecosystem. And then that relationship between the built and the natural world. It's how do we relate our structures to the world around us? And so landscape style is not a very static thing. It's very dynamic. And it's something that you need to think about when you're looking at your own yard. It's not something that you could just start throwing plants in. I guess the cage, would you say cage match style is something that could be a style and a perspective, but there's more to it. It's a lot deeper than you think. So the first thing I want you guys to think about is whether you're thinking about your own yard or particular space in your yard is what is your perception of your style and space? When you're looking at that particular area, do you see it as good? Do you see it as bad? Do you see it as completely ugly? I like the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's true. We have our own personal perceptions of the yard. Your neighbor may say, oh, that looks really nice. But you're like, oh, I got to do something about that. Or vice versa. You may think it's beautiful and your neighbor thinks it's really ugly. So, but you need to find out what your perception is of that space. Are you happy with the space in your yard? Do you think it needs work? Are you kind of in between? Is there certain things you like, and what do you like about it? That's really important. A lot of times we say, oh, I like the way my yard looks, but what particularly do you like about it? That's really important. So answer that question. Um, Jot down some notes. What is your perception of your space and your style? Do you like it? Do you want to change it? What makes you happy? So I love this image. And if we have anybody from Oklahoma, I'm sorry, but we do have Illinois on here. But you know, we have, if you look at this last image, we have this kind of beautiful setting, it feels peaceful. Then you go into people taking perception very literally. They're really excited about Illinois and Oklahoma. And then we go to this. So is it good, bad, or ugly? Really, it's all in the eye of the beholder, but there are certain forms and standards that we need to look at. So theme and style, this is where we start the conversation. So every landscape style has a theme, whether it's looking at the house style. So whatever your house style is, do you even know what your house style is? Some people don't. A lot of times, a lot of our newer, especially in the Chicagoland area, a lot of our new suburbs have mixed styles. So it's important to kind of ask those questions. What is your house style? What garden type are you looking for? We know our traditional garden types, and I've mentioned a few there. You know, you have your cottage, your English, native, Japanese. What is the garden type you're looking for? And what are you focusing on an item? Are you looking at habitat particularly? Are you looking at, you know, antique style, sculptural? Are you focusing more on bees, butterflies? That's a real common item focus as of late. And then what emotions are you looking? A lot of times backyard, we feel like that's more the hidden or open because you want it to be more of a play space. But we kind of forget about that in the front yard. A lot of times we think our front yards don't have any emotion, but they really do. The front yard is the door to our home. And especially now that we've been spending more time at home, what emotion do you want that to bring? Do you have to have all 4 of these? No, you might pick 1 or 2. But I think you have to have something that anchors your style. There has to be a theme behind it. Whether you focus more on the house, the garden, and a particular item, or an emotion, each part of your yard has to have something that anchors it. You have to have a theme. Just like when we decorate rooms in our house, there's a theme. We either have a color scheme that we work with, we either have, you know, a wood grain that we focus on, a piece of furniture that we work around. It all has kind of a theme to it. And different rooms have different themes. So think about that as you start developing your style. Where do I want to start with this? What is my main theme and focus? Direction. This is extremely important. What are you trying to accomplish with your yard? Some people have, you know, are blessed with big yards. Some people have small yards, but you can always provide direction. Do you want it to be, is there depth that you need to create? Are you looking to stretching the space? Because you have a small space. You can make a small yard look big. It can be done, but you have to play with that direction. Where do you want the eye to focus? I love this picture in the lower right-hand corner as you're facing the screen, because you have these beautiful, interesting pieces of artwork. Then you have a layer of a pond. Then you have kind of this open lawn expanse. And then finally you have the cool part of nature, mountains in the background. It's interesting, like, what does your eye see first in that picture? Do you see the artwork? Do you see the pond? Do you see the mountains, the trees that frame that? What are you looking to draw the eye to? I always tell people I have a 2-year-old, so I do the open shut. I don't know if anybody knows that old nursery rhyme, open shut with your eyes. But close your eyes and then open them quickly in your backyard or your front yard or whatever space you're envisioning. What do you see first? Do you focus on, you know, the beautiful oak tree that's in your yard, or do you focus on your neighbor's garage, or do you focus on the beautiful perennial bed you have in front? What is your main focus? So making sure you have direction and depth is really important. What do you want the eye to focus on? And the reason why I include this beautiful mountain photo is because nature does it perfectly for us. They give us that, you know, short, wide, tall, long, short expanse. Nature frames the world for us perfectly. And then when we take that idea into our yards, we forget that our yards have to have depth. Our landscapes have to have depth. Likewise, views. Do you want it to extend it? Do you want to stop or block? I can't tell you how many times I talk to clients and neighbors, and they're saying, I want to block that my neighbor's this, or I want to block our garage because it's just so big, or I want to, it's like, why do you want to block things? You want to simply pause and stop the eye. So I did put block in here as part of the conversation, but you just want to pause the eye and stop the eye to redirect and focus. And direction can be great with that. Composition, you always need to have a foreground, a middle ground, a background. It goes back to the elementary days when you were in school and you were in art class and your teacher was telling you foreground, middle ground, background. Same thing if you were in English class, it has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Our landscapes have to say that. And a lot of times when I'm talking to clients and working with them, a lot of times when there's something wrong with their landscape, it's because they're missing one of those pieces. So I always put direction as second to theme, because it's really important that direction a lot of times is the stumbling block for people. You haven't created that depth and that experience, and so you kind of stop short. That's where our themes start getting lost if we don't have a solid direction. Focus. So as you direct people, you have to have a focus. So we have to be looking at something. So is it an item? Is it particularly item? Is it a piece of artwork? Is it a location or a destination? Surroundings. Is it something that, is it working with and within the garden? I love like this bottom image where you have these beautiful floating chairs. They're artwork in itself, but they're working within the confines of the garden. Even in this more very formal English garden, we have this urn, which is kind of the item focus in this garden, but it's working with the surroundings because it's matching the theme. It's giving you direction. It's making you focus towards the long sculptural array of trees and the building in the background. So what does it create? Is it working with its surroundings? Don't just place an item in your garden and say it's good. Now, this is where I talk about, and I'll talk about it a little bit later too, and you'll see some great images about that, but we all have our lawn ornaments and our lawn art features, our tchotchkes, so to speak, of the landscape world. It's okay to put those in the garden, but make sure they're following the theme and making sure, even if they don't follow your theme, sometimes they don't, they're sentimental, they're from grandparents or such, or from friends, you can fit them in. And still make them a focus or a subtlety without making them front and center. The pink flamingos, I don't know so much. That could be that could be interesting, but even pink flamingos have their place. Movement, moving. This is the one thing that people are resilient against. The focus in your garden can change over time. And in fact, it does. We were just having a conversation before everybody jumped on, and we were talking about how you plant trees and in 15 years they grow. Oh my goodness, it's a novel idea, but they create shade and they create change in the garden. Every time you put a plant in the garden, it changes and it grows. And so the movement and the focus in your garden is going to change over time, whether you want it to or not. So why are we so glued to this perception that once we put things in the garden, they can't move? How many times do you redecorate rooms in your house? At least once. Hopefully you have at least once. Move furniture, get new furniture, you move things around. It's exactly the same in the garden. You have to create movement. Don't be afraid to move art in the garden. Move furniture. Do it around seasons. Do it around focus, bloom, and structure. I have a couple structural art pieces in my garden that I move throughout the season because I have some really beautiful spring perennials blooming here, and then I have some summer stuff that's cool, and I want the art to be focused around that. So my eye goes there first. Don't be afraid to move things around. Obviously, we get stuck in our kind of world that, okay, we have a patio, so that's where our furniture has to go. And we have this cool fire pit and outdoor kitchen or whatever we may have, and it's concrete, so I'm not gonna like move my concrete patio every time I want to rearrange the garden. No, it's the same concept of rearranging rooms in the house. You don't, well, most of us don't tear down walls when we want to rearrange things in our house. You don't have to tear the structure down of your garden, but you can move some of those pieces, parts, and really create movement and focus in the garden. Color, everybody's favorite. So this is what people most often think about when they think of landscape style. They think of color. I have a color palette. I have a color scheme. Yes, it's important to have a color palette. Don't get me wrong. But is your focus a single color? Is it seasonality? Do you have yellows blooming first and then blues and then greens? Do you have the random paint pots like up in the corner that just you have to have every color? The color is an important part, making sure you're dealing with cool colors and warm colors, single colors, making sure that you don't mix those. Color can also be a distraction in the garden, and sometimes green is a beautiful color. So don't be afraid to think about that as well. Dynamics. How does it feel in the space? How do you move in the space? What interests you in the space? These are 3 things that I always ask people when they're in their gardens. What do they feel when they walk out the door? What do they feel when they pull up in their driveway? What's your immediate reaction? Do you feel safe? Do you feel comforted? Where do you move in the space? When you step out your back door, where do you gravitate towards first? What draws your interest in the space? And then build from there. A lot of us can't afford or have the time to renovate our entire landscapes all at once. We do it in phases. So what impassions you first? What do you want to locate? What do you want to go towards? And then start working from there and create your theme and grow it from there. What medium are you using? Style can also be described by overall composition. So we talk about the style being, about the house and things, but it also can be about the medium. Your style can be kind of drawn together through medium. It can be kind of haphazard. It can be chaotic, so to speak, but what if you focus on a wood medium? What if you focus on plants? What if you have mostly trees and shrubs? What if you focus on, I like concrete. I like the dimensions of concrete and I have colors and textures. Or my decor. I have this really beautiful, I like this bottom picture. I have this red furniture. And even though my landscape really doesn't, the plant material doesn't tie together, I have red furniture throughout the garden that ties it together. So to give you hope to those that think they're no longer have any control over your landscape medium and you're the chaotic people, find furniture that ties it together. Find a natural element that you can tie it together. Because it's things change and it's okay to move that, but you can use medium as kind of a way to connect everything. And then when your friends come over, you can say, oh, my garden has style. I'm using the wood theme, and you can make yourself feel excited about it. So plants. So this is where we all gravitate towards. When we're thinking about landscape style, we think about plants. So I wanted to spend a little bit longer time talking about that today. What do plants give us in the landscape, and what do they provide? So I've kind of done a kind of a quick breakout of what woody plants give us. Obviously, structure and form. They're giving us anchors. They're giving us organization. You want to put those things in your garden first, because chances are you're not going to be moving them around every year. So you want to get those anchored. You want to make sure you're purposeful in those and planting those with a purpose. But your herbaceous material, that's everything else. That's the fun filler that provides your depth and your structure, color. It provides protection. It's that nutrient balance. But it's the fun part. It's what everybody gravitates towards. It's the colors. It's the flowers. It's what gives your garden depth and texture. And then we have the annual side of things. It's always seasonality. It can color. It can change. There's a lot of texture and flexibility, but there's also a lot of cost. There's a lot of maintenance. So there's a lot of things that annuals provide. So I always encourage people use those in very purposeful ways and eliminate some of that stress on your landscape. So those are kind of the medium that everybody loves to play with is plants. So plant function. Points of accent. Plant function is all about where we direct our eye. We're always looking for that flower. What's that next color? What's that next bloom? We got seed pods and we've got texture leaves and colored leaves. And they move around. It's something that changes. One of your fellow participants is talking about, I move my perennials around every year because I don't ever get them right. It's true. You want to create that point of accent and move them around the garden. Sometimes plants move themselves around the garden just out of natural habit. They self-seed, they move things around a little bit, and you get an alternate plan. So remember that they create that accent. So if your accent rotates a little bit, or you don't want it to rotate. Maybe you don't use plants. If you're okay with it moving, then plants are a good choice because plants are going to do their own thing. But you definitely want to think about that. If you want a really accented focus in your backyard, plants probably aren't going to do it for you because they're going to change and evolve. It's really exciting about herbaceous plants because they really highlight your woody plants. How many times do you walk in your backyard and forget you have trees? I don't know if anybody does that, but it's really exciting to see the dynamics that a lot of times we just see the trunk and we take advantage of, we have this beautiful canopy. If you have no trees in your yard or small trees, immature trees in your yard, then maybe you value that a little bit more. But it's really interesting to see how plants highlight that. Trunks are beautiful. They have textures, they have colors, they have depth. And plants can help direct your eye towards that and enhance some of those beautiful things that we kind of forget about in the garden. Color and persistence. Plant function is really important for that. We always strive. I think that's probably the number one question I get from clients is, how do I keep it all through the season? How do I keep it as long as possible? And how do you give me more color? This is one of the biggest plant functions that we have to focus on in the style of your landscape is, how do we keep that color going? How do we keep that alive? Something that I've added onto this is talking about what I call the fade. We get so excited about color in the spring because we've had our long winters, and unless you live in an area that doesn't really have winter, here in Chicagoland, we have winters. So we get really excited about that first burst of color and we just want it to last forever. But that's not what nature does. So we need to really figure out the seasonality. You need to have that one persistent thing in the garden that gives you color, whether it's a medium, we talked about items, artwork, but you need to keep it going. Plants are going to have their highlight season and then they're going to fade. And while they're fading, you need to be able to direct other parts of the garden to be the focus. And then they're going to have this really blast of color and then they're going to fade. So the fade is really important when we're talking about plant function and landscape style, because you need to understand that sometimes flowers fade, but they can look really cool in the intermedium. One of my favorite flowers for that is yarrow. That's pretty universal throughout most of the United States, but yarrow has this beautiful blast of color and then it fades to this kind of russet brown, and then it stays there unless you cut it off, and then it does rebloom and it's not as big, but it comes back. But that can be a beautiful color, and it's an accent in the garden. It's this darker brown or russet color. It can highlight another flower that then is coming upon. So think about the fade and what that means for your garden. Whether you cut those back and just have this leafy foliage, what that means and where it directs your eye. It's really important with the style of your garden. Remember that colors fade, and how you respond to where those colors are fading is really important. Ecosystem function. This is something that we totally don't always see. If for a lot of you said your garden is more natural, this is something you should always be thinking about. And I know it's come to the surface in our society recently because we're really concerned about the bees and the butterflies, but it's important that your plants have function, that your landscape not only has a style, but it has a function too. You're providing food and habitat and shelter, and you're complementing the functional roles of woody plants. A lot of times our trees do a lot for us, but the understory can help with that. And don't forget that there's other things going on out there. Likewise, a lot of times plants solve those functions and styles in our garden. A lot of times our gardens don't let us do the styles that we want because we have water problems or we have erosion issues. And so remembering that our style can help us solve some of these problems is really important. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Style can be really interesting. So when we dive into design style, this is where we get into the nuts and bolts. So design style is not your landscape style. So I want to make that very clear. Design style is not landscape style. Your landscape style is all the interdisciplinary parts, so to speak. It's the things that we just talked about, direction and medium and focus and form. But then the design style is just a part of that. And A lot of times we focus just on the design style. And that's why I had that poll question on there. What is your style? Because it's not just that. This is just a part of that whole process. But it's still a very important part. So I want to dive into kind of some of the formal and structural styles here. So obviously formal is pretty self-explanatory. There's balance, there's structure, there's a focal point, paths, perimeters, those are all really part of that formal style. There's a lot of structure to it. It puts the mind at ease. When you look at a formal garden, whether you like it or not, personal preference, it puts the mind at ease. There's a balance, there's a symmetry to it. I love this picture, and the reason why I put this picture up here is because for some people, they would say this is more of a natural looking garden. You have some of that woodland feel in here, yet it's very formal. This is a very strictly formal garden. Does it have some of those natural looking elements to it because of the textures? Certainly, but it's still a very formal garden. But part of that style is the woodland feel. That's its focus. So yes, this design style is formal, but it has a focus on the medium as being this item, this woodland feel. So you can start seeing how some of these tie together. Formal can also really contain the herbaceous plants. So woodies usually create this structure. 9 times out of 10, when you think of a formal garden, your woody plant material, your trees and shrubs are really creating that formal appearance. Now, does it have to be a formally pruned hedge garden like this beautiful garden? No. Woodies can formally enclose things, even if you don't prune them into beautiful topiary shapes. So think about that as a formal style. We're seeing that a lot in the newer, what we call modern landscape style that's coming out. People and designers and landscape architects are using woody plants to create structure, but not putting the management into them to create topiaries. Because people don't want to manage things. They don't want to have the time and effort they want as low management as possible, but woodies are still creating that structure. A lot of times with formal, you have a lot of art. Art is always formally introduced. If you go back to English garden styles, French garden styles, Spanish garden styles, a lot of your European styles go back to art being the focus and the plants being the secondary. Structure, a lot of times you had pergolas and you had small temple areas. You had those architectural features as the form. A lot of people are now in formal styles, you'll use small gazebos, benches, small bridges, things that create that structural feature. It's always manicured. Formal is very manicured. Everything is in its place, and when it gets out of its place, you get rid of it, or you transplant it, or you move it around. It's very manicured and managed to keep that formal style and that balance. Because if something's out of place, if you see an orange flower in this beautiful sea of lavender, it's going to disturb your eye and it's going to stop it. So usually it's monochrome. It's a very simple palette. So if you like that formal style, you need to keep in a simple color. You can make a very natural looking garden look formal by just keeping a simple color. And that's a really easy way to do it as far as your design style. Then we go into the more informal styles. So we're looking more at very organic lines, flowering drifts, things kind of move around, colors move around. A lot of times you have cool colors and warm colors. So your design style is focusing on warm or cool instead of a single color palette. There's lots of depth. So everywhere you look, you see, and I love this picture for that reason. It's a pretty straight path. At first glance, you'd say this is a formal garden because it has a straight path, it has symmetrical lines. You kind of see there's a hedge on 2 sides, kind of. It's going towards a structure. You have the layering of the woody plants kind of on the outside, holding back the herbaceous material on the inside. That's why I put this picture up here, because it's challenging the informal. It's very informal. There was a design of this at one point in time, and then they interplanted with the herbaceous and let it kind of take over. So even in this picture, there's a little bit of formal mixed in there. That's why design style is not a landscape style. It's a part of your landscape style. But there's definitely this layering system. And informal, when you look at a space in your landscape, it's going to have so many layers, you're not going to know what to do with it. Things are going to be hiding behind other things. You're going to have these multiple layers and you're not going to know what's going on. Organized natural. So this is what a lot of people call organic or naturalistic. It's organized natural. I like using that term because you're trying to mimic nature. You're organizing nature as best of your ability and hoping it turns out okay. So you have the plant drifts, you have the color palette that's in there. Pinks start, and then you have purples, and then other things happen. There's blues, but there's still an organization to it. It looks very natural. You know, in this image, you have some salvia creeping in to the allium space, and nobody cares. Nobody's gonna pull it out because it's just kind of migrating and doing its own thing. So you want it to look purposeful, but not so formal that everything has to be, every plant has its own space. Plants become friends and kind of hug each other, and it's okay. But it anchors the architecture. The difference between this and informal is there's a feeling of place. You get a little bit of that symmetry and balance. There's something comforting about it, and you really don't know why. But I challenge you to go into your local neighborhood and drive past other people's homes. And if you, or go to parks, go to local parks. Do you have a landscape like this? Is there a landscape that you know that you drive past and you really, there's a balance there, but it still looks natural? Chances are it was planned. And that's why you feel that kind of inner peace and feeling about it, because it looks like nature, but it's not. And this is where I love to talk about, you need to edit, manage, and ignore. And this is for all of you out there that felt like their landscape was natural or chaotic. This is my 3 golden rules that I always tell people when they're looking at plant material and trying to find that organized natural is understand what you want to edit. Are there certain plants that you know if they get out of control, they're going to take over the garden and it's going to be bad? Are there certain plants that get in the garden that if you don't take them out, it's really going to upset that balance? Is it going to interrupt that long view because it's taller? Is it going to create, you know, a yellow flower in a purple seed that you don't want there? So understand what plants you absolutely have to edit. With that being said, maybe you don't want to put them in the landscape to begin with. I know it may be your favorite, but maybe it just doesn't fit. Put it in your neighbor's yard so you can see it from a distance, but making sure you know what you really have to edit and what matters. This is really important for all of us that love to be in our gardens, but also love to not always work in our gardens. We don't want to spend all of our time playing in the garden. We want to sit and enjoy ourselves. So what makes sense? Manage. This is huge. What needs to be managed? What do you need to cut back? What do you need to divide every so many years? What really has to have that development of management? I like using the word management instead of maintenance. And I use that term because we don't really maintain anything unless you're doing topiary, and that's a totally different story. But nature in itself in our landscape, we manage. To keep that style, to keep that, we manage and we critique it to, as nature grows and develops, we manage it. We don't maintain that same thing. I like to compare this, and when people are talking to children, we don't maintain our children. Our children don't stay young forever. They grow up, they change, but we manage their growth period and we help them become successful adults. It's the same thing we do in the garden. We manage those little baby plants when we set them out, and we hope that they grow and survive, but we don't really maintain their current state because tomorrow they're totally different than today. The biggest thing and the hardest thing for us in the garden is to ignore things. Besides weeds, and that's a totally different story, but how do we ignore things in the garden? When some things start getting out of place, do we ignore it and just let nature take its course? Or are we persistent to go out there and divide it and change it and move it? Ignoring is a big part of managing, and we don't do it as often as we should. And I'm as guilty as the next person. I'm like, oh, I got to move that because it's creeping into that, and I don't want it. Let it go. See what happens. Let nature do its thing, and you might like it even better at the beginning. As I talked about before, that organized natural creates kind of this harmony and balance. It can be very subtle. It can be very bold. This is an example of a very bold landscape where it is organized natural, but there's very bold colors. There's a few more annuals in this one. But there's depth and complexity. Organized natural is making nature work together, and it might look simple, but it's very complex. So now I'm going to dive into kind of the next part of this conversation. When we're actually talking about moving and putting your landscape style together, there's a couple things you need to remember, that it's about composition. So the next kind of couple slides, I'm going to go through composition. How do we pull all these things together? And what things should we look at? And some of these are basics of natural art. Some of these are basics of natural horticulture, but just kind of bringing those back to the forefront of your memory on how we compose the landscape, and how we make that form and function work together. So composition, we're looking at form, size, and mass. What I talked about at the beginning, making sure you're setting up those trees and those structural parts first. We have to definitely look at forming the whole framework. That's why a lot of people do hardscapes first. They put their patios in, they put their house on. What do you do when you first buy a piece of land? You build a house. You put the main structures in. So looking at that form, size, and mass, what do you want this thing to look like? Where is the depth going to be? Where is the mass and the form? Do you have a tree that's really pruned high? Do you have just this trunk that's the focus? Do you have this big, beautiful, organic live oak where you have this form to work with that you don't want to cover up with anything too tall? So looking at that first and understanding what your site can handle and what that looks like. A composition, you're looking at lines and patterns, rhythm and sequence. These are all basics of design. We're looking at how lines form spaces. We're looking at patterns in the landscape. Do we have trees that create these patterns, that frame these views? Is there a rhythm we want to create as we're walking through a path, as we're walking by a stream? Do we want to create a sequence of spaces? Do we want this to be a room, so to speak? That this is the yellow room, and then we move to the purple room and the green room. Do we want to create this sequence of experiences and spaces? Do we have an area where the kids play? Do we have a vision of where that's going? So composition is important in this aspect because you want to understand in your landscape style how pattern and rhythm can make a big difference. And likewise, if you're doing it in phases like we most are, what's that first sequence that I do? And how is that going to affect the pattern in the future? When you go to your favorite plant sale and you buy a bunch of plants, like I have in the past, where do you put them? And are you planning for that next step? And that's where sequence comes in handy. Back to color, I have to mention color again because it's our favorite thing. And I have to mention that green is a color again because that's always exciting about the composition of our spaces. But don't forget that color also invites texture. Color is that part and it's that composition, but texture. And this is where I have to hold back sometimes because a lot of times I look at plants for texture and sometimes I forget about the color. I did this in one of my portions of my own yard. And when the flower came out, I was like, oh, that's kind of a harsher yellow than I need in that area. Now I have to transplant it. So keep that in mind when you're doing composition, that there needs to be a color texture balance. I know that new perennial just came out and it's the coolest thing under the sun. I get that excited too, but make sure you go back again to that landscape style. You know, take a piece of paper and write it down. It's really important that you kind of set all these things up and continue them. And I think after this talk, we can send you some kind of a cheat sheet of questions that can help with that. But remember that keeping that color and texture in balance, that really makes a big difference. Balance, harmony, and unity. This is really important because this is where we all feel comfortable. This is our safety zone. This is when we're sitting on our couch in our pajamas and we're feeling really good about things. It's where the landscape comes together. And this is, I find, where most people tend to fall off the wagon because they get really excited about their landscape style. I'm going to do a Japanese garden and I've got all the pieces parts. I've got the cool pergola. I've got the art features. I've got the plants that match. But they forget that there still has to be this balance and harmony. You can't just get overexcited. Sometimes less is more, sometimes more is less. So you need to remember where that comes and you find that balance and harmony. You may want to put 8 different plants in your landscape. You may want to put that extra, lantern or light fixture or art piece. You need to make sure you find the balance and harmony and unity. And then if you do find this really great art piece, maybe you need to edit something out to create that harmony again. So making sure when you're thinking through that composition of your landscape style, go back to the original style. Go back to what your medium is. Go back to what your direction is, your focus, those first things I talked about, and making sure that it's still in balance and harmony with that original kind of vision that you had for your landscape. Do you go outside and you take a breath of fresh air and you feel comfortable in that space? Also remembering that it has to be year round. I don't care what part of the country you live in, we all deal with seasons, whether they're more evident than others, but how do you create that interest and kind of continuity year round? How do you create that longevity? How do you understand that this is what it looks like in the spring, this is what it looks like in the fall, this is when I have more color, this is when I have less color. This is the conversation I like to have with people where go through your garden. It's a really cool experiment. Go through your garden. This is a great time to do now when it is winter time. And think about, just pick one bed, one planting bed that you have, or one area of your yard, and make a list and say, this is what I look at in the summer or in the springtime. Maybe you look at bulbs. Okay, that's great. Then what do I look at in the summertime? I have 4 things blooming and my patio furniture is out. That's great. What do I look at in the fall? I usually put some decor out, I put some pumpkins, and this is blooming. The leaves are changing color, okay? And then what do you look at in the wintertime? Well, my patio furniture is put away, so my patio looks bare. Find out where your balance is. It's a really cool experiment to do. You don't realize how much it changes and where your focus is. Are you really spring heavy? Are you summer heavy? Most people find that they're pretty summer heavy. So what can you do to balance out the other part of those seasons? What can you move around to create a little more balance in the landscape? And these things make a big difference. That's why I actually put both of them on there, longevity and kind of that continuity year-round effect, because they're really 2 different things. So I challenge you to take a part of your yard and make those lists and figure out where your heaviness is. You know, you might find that half your yard is very summer heavy and the other half is very fall heavy. Where do you find that balance and how do you blend those 2 together? And then remembering that nature changes. Nature changes minute by minute. And what you see today, you might not see tomorrow. This is something I also challenge you to do. Take a week this summer when things are looking beautiful and wonderful in your yard and go out every day and see what you notice. See where your eye is drawn and what changes every day. Does a new flower open? Do you see a bird resting here or nesting, or to see what changes? And always remember that's what gets you excited about your theme and the style of your landscape, is that it's always changing and you need to change with it. I always like to mention this little part, environmental selection and management. Remember that nature does its own thing. It's integrated for function. We have to remember that we need to use more indigenous and native species. They do better. They survive. They can be thrown in the gauntlet and come out the other side. We need to be flexible in our placement. Nature does its own thing. Sometimes things live, sometimes things die, sometimes things migrate around. And we need to always make sure we keep out the invasive species. This was actually a controlled burn at the Morton Arboretum, which is near us here in DuPage County. And I love this picture because it's just a refreshing. If we get frustrated with the landscape around us, nature kind of refreshes itself, whether we want it to or not. And obviously we're not burning in our backyards. Maybe some of you are if you have prairie areas, but nature will do that in your own yard. Whether you come to me and you say that I have shrubs that are overgrown, what do I do? It's time for a refresh. It's time for you to look at your landscape again and see what needs refreshed. What do you need to get rid of? What do you need to put back in for diversity? What do you need to use that's existing? A lot of things are beautiful and existing, even if you don't see them as purposeful at the beginning. One of my biggest challenges to new homeowners is, what do you like that's existing? And a lot of times people are like, I don't care if everything goes. That's not true. There's some really value in what's existing. It depends on what your landscape style is, if that can stay or go. And always educate yourself. If you find something new, don't be afraid to see what else is out there. Management. Think about how much time you want to be in your garden. This is huge. And maybe this should be the first slide. Maybe I did this backwards today. But how much time do you want to spend in your garden? And what do you want to be doing with that time? Maybe that's another question I need to put on there. But how particular will you be with keeping your style? A lot of times people say, oh, I started out with this cottage garden look, but now it's kind of more a naturalistic, chaotic look because they didn't put the time to maintain it and manage it. So thinking about that is really important. How much time do you want to spend in your garden maintaining that? Do you want to create the classic architectural European garden look? Or do you want to be more a little loose with it? You want to have that natural look? Do you want to be focused on more plant material, structure, pathways? How strict do you want to be with your style? I tell people you don't have to be like spot on strict, but you need to still keep it so it's recognizable. That's really important. If you have a friend that comes over and you say, oh, my house is, a ranch style, your neighbor knows what you mean. Your friends and family understand what ranch looks like. When somebody comes to your garden, they need to feel the same way. It needs to be somewhat recognizable to somebody else outside of your own purview. And what is your most important goal? This is a really important question to ask. What do you really want to accomplish with your garden? Do you want it to be an outdoor style space? Do you want it to be viewed from a distance? Do you want it to be experienced? This is how the front yard, backyard thing we really get to talk about is your front yard can be a very distinct style and it can be very different in the backyard. And that's okay because your goal in your front yard, a lot of times people are like, I want the curb appeal. Is that really the only goal in your front yard? There's probably another goal out there. It's not just curb appeal. It could be about, yeah, you want it to look nice for your neighbors and you don't want them calling and complaining because you have like 6-foot blue stem in your front yard. And that's when we're talking about natural plants. It's okay to use cultivars. I am a big proponent of native plants, but sometimes you can't put 6 to 8 foot tall native grasses in your front yard. It just doesn't work. And you still keep with that naturalistic style. But what is the goal in that front yard? Is it really to impress your neighbors? Maybe. We like to share our joy with our neighbors and we love our neighbors, hopefully. But what's another goal for your front yard? For me, when I come down my driveway, I want to see cool things happening. It's also for me. It's for me to enjoy that space. My front yard is also a space where I like to go walking. Because I don't use my front yard like most people don't use their front yards as much as their backyards or side yard. What can I experience in my front yard? It's a great walking path for me. If I'm on a phone call, which many of us are at home now, can I walk outside and really enjoy my space? So remember what your goals are for that. In your backyard, a lot of times people are like, oh, that's my private area. That's my area for walking around or playing with the kids or entertaining. I have this nice entertainment area where I bring people, but there's more than one goal. So remember, I always tell people the rule of 3. You have at least 3 goals that should be important to you, whatever place in the yard it is. So as we wrap up here in the last few minutes before we have some question answer time, I want to go through, and this is usually more fun if we're in person, but I want to go through and just show you a series of images and make a few comments about the landscape style. There's some beautiful things here. You can take notes and see what you like and don't like and even go back and view the presentation later. But here you see formal. That's the landscape style. You see art being the centerpiece. You see direction being very important. It's very monochrome. It's very textural. There's a lot of textures happening here. This is, and people can place their guesses if they want to in chats and stuff. Feel free to chat and tell me what you think. But what do you see here? There's structure. There is a symmetry. There's a rhythm here that's really beautiful. You have hardscape, softscape, hardscape, softscape. You have height, you have depth, you have foreground, middle ground, background. These are all things, it's not just, okay, this looks like a natural garden. It's beyond that, it's a little bit deeper. This image, obviously, it's very much in tune to the style of the house. This is catered to the style of house, and the lawn is the side feature. It's the style. You're focusing strictly on the house in this instance, but it's a little more natural. But there's some organization there. Very formal, but yet there's rhythm, there's natural edges, there's some of that formality, very much directional, very much textural in this instance. color palette. You're using the cool tones of the hardscape to really balance with the colors of the plant material. So there's a lot of interesting things happening here. Again, what do you see first? If they didn't design the steppers in a very formal way, you'd think this is just an open prairie natural space. But it was very purposeful. It's very purposeful, leading you to the edge here and then turning your view and direction. I really love this image for that reason. What do you see here? What do you see the balance? The artwork is obviously the feature. You're framing views. You're looking at that textural element. You're looking at heights. Here, height is really important, and you're playing with those layers. Color is sprinkled in, but very subtle, really. The color is there and it's bold, but it's very subtle as far as it plays with the rest of the landscape. Water is the element here. That's the focus. You're even using topiary as that water for movement. You're using the spiral effect to show water and texture and movement. So movement here is very important, even though this is a very formal garden. Destination. This is a focal point destination garden. It's a side garden area. You're looking at the movement through the space, but the destination is more important. My eye immediately goes to the end of that path. I want to know what's beyond that hill. I want to go there. Even though you have these beautiful color pops happening all around me, I don't really see that. I'm more worried about the destination. And so you can see how a lot of these tie in different elements. And I'm just going to scroll through a couple of these so we can get towards the end. But understanding that it's not just one thing or another, there's a balance of things that are happening. And some of you say, oh, I love some of these pictures, and oh, I hate some of these pictures. That's the cool part about landscape style, is it can be in all different ways and shapes and forms. It can be very formal and historical with edible gardens. It can be kind of weirdly balanced with these interesting art pieces. This is one of my favorite images from a client's house because her artwork was very eclectic, but at the same time, she made it work in a very weird way. None of these art pieces really fit together at all. And to each their own, some people may not like this, but it still has a balance and a shape and a form. Very open, very prairie. Fall is definitely a big feature in this garden. I love this image because it's very bold, it's very crazy looking. This is a really nice image from a friend of mine where you have, this is the front yard, but yet there's a very big goal here. And it's not just to have people walk to the front door, but it's a whole gathering space in the front yard with a piece of lawn. There's so much direction and movement happening here. It's really exciting. And then we have some of the, I had to add this one because this goes to my first picture image, but then we have things that kind of drive our eyes crazy and give us a little bit of craziness on the edge. And then we have things like this. We can calm. I give you the crazy picture and then I give you the calm picture. This creates peace and serenity as far as landscape style. So there's a lot of interesting things as far as landscape style. The important thing is to actually write them down. And I love this picture because we always have to play outside, no matter how old we are. We have to be like little kids and have fun with things. But I want to challenge you. The reason why I love talking to people about landscape style is we always talk about it, but we always forget to actually write it down. Whether you have life goals or however New Year's resolutions, what do? We write them down. And landscape style is that same way. What are our goals for our landscape? What makes us feel comfortable? What do we hope to achieve? What makes us happy? It's really important to find our inspiration. So what are you drawn to? What's your favorite style? Drive around your neighborhood and take pictures of what inspires you. And what do you want your house to look like? What do you want your park to look like, your neighborhood? And then what do you do with that? How do you take that style and that inspiration that makes you excited and actually make it into a landscape style? And I go back to the rule of 3. You find it. So discovering it and writing it down and actually visualizing it is the important first step. Then you work with it. You work with your existing landscape. You work with what you have. Tree-wise, hardscape-wise, what makes sense? What do you really need to get rid of? And don't be afraid to edit. And then creating it. How do you make that come to life? So finding it, we talked about really saying house style, garden type, item, focus, emotion. How do we find it? you can do one or more. You can take one or more of these, but be careful not to do all four. You don't want to end up with ugly. So don't try to cram too many things into one area. It's okay to say, I really love this, but I have to let it go. Maybe the next house I live in, or maybe I can convince my neighbor to change their backyard so I can enjoy it. Work with it. I talked about using existing, how much can you do it and how much can you keep? How much do you need to create? And what main elements do you need to really make that possible? Sometimes you only need one or two things to really make that style come alive. Sometimes you really need to make it really evident throughout to make it come alive. And then creating it. Set the style or styles. You can have a few in there. And then pick your top 3 goals. How do I make this possible? And what does that look like? So thank you. Thank you all for being here today and hanging out with me. I really appreciate it. And questions.
Wow, thank you. That gave me so much to think about. And I just love some of those pictures that you put up there, like trying to envision them in my yard, like, look so, so cool. So thank you so much. That was really awesome. If there are any questions, you can go ahead and drop them in the Q&A box or put them in the chat, either one. But we can take questions now, or I know we're at 2 o'clock, so if you've got to take off, that's fine too. You can always drop an email later. My email address is jviebach@theconservationfoundation.org. And then if it's something that I can't answer, I can always pass it on to Amanda as well. So, all right, let's see. We've got lots of thank yous.
Thank you. I'm glad we all had fun hanging out together, even though I didn't get to see all of you. And I hope this challenges you to think about your landscape a little bit differently, because I feel like that's one of my mottos as part of my own business. And I think it's important. We have to look at nature differently, because nature looks at us differently and it challenges us to do different things. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we talk so much with the Conservation Foundation about native plants and the importance of native plants. And for those of you who are also in this space and are gung-ho and, want to use all the native plants, occasionally we do get a little bit of pushback from folks who, for whatever mistaken reason, seem to think that native means messy or native means weeds. And, as some of these photos that you showed today, they illustrate it's really not what it means. But, right plant, right place. We have to really take that into account so that we don't end up looking messy and unkempt and have, the village called on.
No, that's something I talk about all the time is native plants are beautiful and they can be used in so many ways. And there are so many well-behaved native plants, believe it or not. And it's just a matter of where you put them and how you place them. And
exactly,
they're not unkept. There are a few out there that are kind of unruly. And we might want to avoid those in our suburban or, home landscapes. But to each plant, it's a right plant, right place. And sometimes cultivar is the best answer to that question. I know there's still debates out there if you're going pure native, and there's the cultivar debate. There's a lot of research going on right now about that, and it's really fascinating.
For sure.
But the native conversation is you can have a lot of beautiful native plants. Even it's amazing, and I love to tell this quick story, but in my yard when I came, I had a lot of invasive species, and so I got rid of those. But then even I just started planting a few shrubs because, of course, I just bought a house. I didn't have a lot of money. So I just planted a few shrubs and a couple trees, and it was amazing. Even that, bringing some of those native trees back, bringing some of those native shrubs back, it was amazing. Everybody that came to my house even said that, oh my gosh, you have birds everywhere. What the heck?
Oh, yeah. That makes a big difference, for sure.
It makes a big difference. So it's really exciting to see how that works. And even if you can't, I understand some people are like, I don't like native plants. You pick 2 or 3, interweave them in your garden. You won't even know the difference, and they'll make a huge difference.
Absolutely. Hey, we did get one question here from Barb. She says, I have a raised ranch style house with a picture window with a stone focal point. I want to put in a pollinator garden in a somewhat formal design. How could I incorporate that and have full year bloom in the Chicago area?
That's a great question, Barb. How do you do that? um, Focal point pollinator garden, there's a lot of pollinators. It depends on how much the stone accents that space and how much you want it to be visible. So can you cover it up a little bit in certain angles, what that looks like? But adding a pollinator garden, look for things that have a long bloom time, because obviously you're looking at a small place. If you're looking through a window, it's a very framed view. Outside, not so much. So you can pull more color into the exterior that's outside the window view and expand that pollinator garden. But in that window view, you're going to be very challenged to find something that really blooms year round and keeping in that small little space. So picking something that has kind of a midsummer bloom time, I would pick kind of your powerhouse hitters of the native garden. You've got your beautiful coneflowers, your beautiful black-eyed Susans. Those bloom long and they bloom tall. And those are going to keep that sustainable, and then go outside, because obviously you don't want to have just a pollinator garden that has a summer bloom time. Go outside that picture window view so you create some of this color on the periphery, and it can really, and then you'll have some of those spring bloomers, the fall bloomers, keeping those pollinators there year round. That's very seasonal. But when you're looking at window views, you definitely want to have that really hard hitter summer view in space. So that might be, and if you have some room to play with, the picture windows can be quite large. Usually picture windows minimum are in that 9 feet realm as far as the view. So if you've got 9 feet to work with, you can pack a lot in that small space.
Great. So yeah, there's so many great pollinator plants that go in there. You know, you get your Monarda, you get your butterfly weed, some of those just that have that really bright color with them and are really, as you said, heavy hitters with the butterflies. So yeah, those are all really great options. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Amanda Arnold from Planet Landscapes. Again, go ahead and drop me an email if you have any questions after this. And I can always pass on any questions that you might have that I can't answer. So just a reminder, when you close out of this webinar, you'll be taken to our website that's got some great suggestions on it, along with our native plant guide. So if you're dreaming of spring and trying to plan that new garden and looking for some new plants on there, check out that native plant guide. It is my absolute favorite publication that we put out. So definitely check that out. So thank you, everybody. Take care. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.